Everyone was afraid to get close to this ancient alien warrior, until one human changed everything. The corridors of Nexus Prime fell silent whenever he walked through them. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Children hid behind their parents. Even the bravest traders found urgent business elsewhere when they saw his massive form approaching. Kethvar moved through the station like a living shadow of death. His black armor seemed to absorb the light around him, and his forearms hung at his sides like weapons waiting to strike. Each step of his massive feet echoed through the metal halls, a drumbeat that announced danger to every living being within hearing distance. The ancient Vorthak warrior stood nearly 8 feet tall. His exoskeleton was darker than space itself, covered in scars that told stories of 1,000 battles. Where other species had smooth skin or fur or scales, Kethvar's body was armored by nature. Thick plates of bone-like material protected his chest, back, and limbs. His face was hidden behind a helmet that had fused with his skull centuries ago, leaving only his burning red eyes visible through narrow slits. Nobody remembered exactly how old Kethvar was. Some said he had been fighting wars before the first space stations were built. Others whispered that he was the last survivor of his species, the final remnant of a race that had conquered half the galaxy before disappearing into legend. What everyone knew for certain was that he was dangerous. The Vorthak had been warriors without equal. Their name alone once made entire star systems surrender without a fight. They fought with forearms that could move faster than most eyes could follow. They felt no fear, showed no mercy, and never retreated from battle. Parents across the galaxy still told their children stories about the Vorthak to make them behave. Be good, or the four-armed warriors will come for you in the night. But the Vorthak were gone now. All of them except Kethvar. He served as the head of security for Nexus Prime, the largest trading station in the sector of space. The job suited him perfectly. Nobody dared to cause trouble when they knew he was watching. Pirates avoided the station entirely. Even the most aggressive species kept their voices low and their weapons holstered when doing business here. The station's administrator, a nervous Zalani named Crix, had hired Kethvar decades ago. Back then, the station had been plagued by violence. Traders cheated each other, fights broke out daily, and criminal gangs used the station as their base of operations. Within a month of Kethvar's arrival, all of that stopped. The warrior's reputation preceded him like a weapon of its own. Kethvar rarely spoke unless duty required it. When he did, his voice was deep and cold like metal scraping against stone. He gave orders in short, simple sentences that nobody dared to question. Stop. Leave. Never return. These were usually the only words anyone heard from him. Most days he patrolled the station's corridors in perfect silence. His red eyes swept back and forth, watching for any sign of trouble. He knew every hiding place, every escape route, every weakness in the station's defenses. When he wasn't patrolling, he stood guard at important locations like the main docking bay or the central computer core. The other security officers gave him as much space as everyone else did. They were professionals, trained to handle dangerous situations, but even they felt uncomfortable around the ancient warrior. During security briefings, they spoke to him with careful respect, never looking directly into his burning red eyes. They had all heard the stories about what happened to people who challenged a Vorthak warrior. In the evening, when his shift ended, Kethvar retired to his quarters in the deepest part of the station. His room was simple and bare, containing only a sleeping platform and a small shrine where he honored his dead people. He ate alone, always the same tasteless nutrient paste that kept his ancient body functioning. He never socialized, never relaxed, never showed any emotion other than cold watchfulness. Sometimes, late at night, other residents of the station would hear strange sounds coming from his quarters. Low rhythmic chanting in a language nobody recognized. The words seemed to carry grief and regret, but nobody dared to ask what they meant. Some said he was performing funeral rites for his extinct species. Others believed he was preparing for his own death, which they assumed would come only when the last enemy in the universe was defeated. The truth was more complicated than any of them imagined. Kethvar did mourn his people, but not in the way the others thought. He mourned the civilization they might have become if they had chosen a different path. The Vorthak had been more than just warriors. They had been artists, philosophers, and storytellers. They had created beautiful music and written epic poems about honor and sacrifice. But all of that had been forgotten in the face of their reputation for violence. He remembered the final days of his species with perfect clarity. The endless wars had finally caught up with them. Their enemies had united against them, and the Vorthak homeworld had been destroyed while he was fighting on a distant battlefield. He had returned to find nothing but ash and debris where his people had once lived. The warrior code of his species demanded that he continue fighting until death claimed him. But death seemed to avoid Kethvar. His body had been enhanced by ancient Vorthak technology that kept him young and strong. He could be wounded, but he healed quickly. He could grow tired, but he never seemed to age. He was condemned to immortality in a universe that had no place for him. So he had chosen isolation. He convinced himself that he was a relic of a more violent time, a weapon that had outlived its purpose. He believed that his presence reminded other species of humanity's capacity for cruelty and conquest. Better to remain alone than to inflict his dark legacy on innocent beings. But isolation was its own kind of punishment. Sometimes in the quiet hours between patrol shifts, Kethvar found himself remembering better times. He thought about his brother warriors who had fought beside him with courage and honor. He remembered the songs his people sang before battle, and the stories they told around campfires on distant worlds. He recalled the warmth of belonging to something greater than himself. Those memories made his loneliness sharper. He was the last keeper of Vorthak culture, the only one who remembered their true nature. When he died, all of it would die with him. His people would be remembered only as monsters, their real legacy lost forever. This was the burden that Kethvar carried as he walked the corridors of Nexus Prime. He protected the station not because he enjoyed violence, but because it was the only purpose he had left. He had been a destroyer once, but now he chose to be a guardian. It wasn't redemption, but it was something close to it. As he completed another patrol shift, Kethvar noticed the usual reactions from the station's residents. Fear, respect, and careful distance. He had grown accustomed to these responses over the decades. They no longer hurt him the way they once had. He didn't know that tomorrow would bring a change that would shake the foundation of his carefully constructed isolation. A new arrival was coming to Nexus Prime, someone who would see him not as a legend or a monster, but simply as a person who had been alone for far too long. The ancient warrior settled into his quarters for another night of solitary meditation, unaware that his centuries of loneliness were about to come to an end. Dr. Sarah Chen stepped off the transport ship with 2 heavy bags and a head full of excitement. Nexus Prime was exactly what she had hoped it would be. A massive space station buzzing with activity from dozens of different alien species. As a xenoarchaeologist, she spent most of her time studying dead civilizations through broken pottery and ancient ruins. But here she could observe living cultures from across the galaxy. The docking bay was enormous, with ships of every size and design coming and going constantly. Sarah watched in fascination as tall, blue-skinned Zelani traders argued with crystalline beings that chimed like bells when they spoke. A group of shape-shifting morphics flowed past her like living liquid, while small, furry creatures she didn't recognize scurried between the larger species carrying packages and messages. Sarah was human, which made her something of a curiosity herself. Humans had only joined the galactic community 50 years ago, and they were still considered newcomers by most other species. They were known for being adaptable and curious, sometimes to the point of recklessness. Other species often found human behavior unpredictable, but generally harmless. As Sarah made her way through the crowd, she noticed something strange. The busy flow of traffic seemed to part suddenly, creating a wide, empty space in the middle of the docking bay. Conversation stopped, and many of the aliens moved quickly toward the exits. Sarah looked around in confusion, wondering if there was some kind of emergency. Then she saw him. The largest being she had ever encountered was walking slowly through the bay. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in black armor that seemed to absorb light. 4 arms hung at his sides, and his face was hidden behind a helmet with glowing red eyes. Every step he took echoed through the suddenly quiet space. Sarah had read about the Vorthak in her xenoarchaeology studies, but she had assumed they were extinct. According to the historical records, they had been a warrior species that disappeared from the galaxy centuries ago. Seeing one in person was like encountering a living dinosaur. Unlike everyone else in the docking bay, Sarah didn't run or hide. Instead, she watched with professional interest as the massive warrior conducted what appeared to be a security patrol. He moved with careful precision, checking corners and exits with the practiced eye of someone who had been doing this job for a very long time. When the warrior's patrol brought him near Sarah, she did something that surprised even herself. She nodded politely and said, "Good afternoon." Kethvar stopped walking, his burning red eyes fixed on the small human woman standing calmly in front of him. In all his decades at Nexus Prime, nobody had ever greeted him so casually. Most beings either fled or stood frozen in terror when he approached. "Afternoon," he replied after a moment, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. Sarah smiled. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. I just arrived to study the archaeological collection here. Could you point me toward the archives?" The warrior stared at her for several long seconds. She showed no signs of fear or discomfort, just polite interest. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to him like a normal person that he almost didn't know how to respond. "Level 7, he said finally. "Central corridor, blue section." "Thank you," Sarah said. "I appreciate it." She walked away without looking back, leaving Kethvar standing alone in the docking bay. For the first time in decades, he felt genuinely puzzled. The human had treated him like any other station employee, not a legendary monster to be feared and avoided. Sarah found the archives easily enough, following the warrior's directions to a large complex of storage rooms and research facilities. The collection was impressive. Artifacts from hundreds of different civilizations, carefully cataloged and preserved. As a xenoarchaeologist, it was like being given access to the galaxy's greatest treasure vault. She spent the first few days exploring the collection and getting familiar with the station's layout. Nexus Prime was like a small city floating in space with residential areas, shopping districts, and entertainment zones. The diversity of species living and working together fascinated her. What fascinated her even more was how everyone reacted to the Vorthak warrior. She encountered him several more times during her first week, and the response was always the same. Conversations stopped, crowds dispersed, and beings hurried away as quickly as possible. But Sarah noticed other things too. She saw him gently help an elderly Zelani who had dropped his packages, carefully gathering the scattered items and handing them back without saying a word. She watched him break up a potential fight between two drunk traders, using just his presence to make them reconsider their actions. He never seemed to use violence or even threaten it. His reputation alone was enough to maintain order. Sarah began to suspect that there was more to Keth, far than the fearsome legend everyone believed in. Her opportunity to learn more came when she discovered a collection of Vorthak artifacts in the deepest part of the archives. The items had been gathered from various dead worlds and abandoned battlefields, weapons, armor fragments, and ceremonial objects that provided glimpses into a lost civilization. Most of the artifacts were labeled with basic descriptions, but Sarah could tell that whoever had cataloged them didn't really understand their significance. The person who wrote the labels had focused on the weapons and armor, treating everything as military equipment. But Sarah's trained eye could see artistic elements, religious symbols, and cultural markers that suggested a much more complex society. She spent several days studying the artifacts, making detailed notes and taking photographs, but there were too many gaps in her knowledge. The Vorthak language was only partially understood, and many of the objects' purposes remained mysterious. What she really needed was someone who had lived in that culture. That's when she decided to approach Kethvar directly. She found him during his evening patrol, walking alone through the quieter sections of the station. Sarah had noticed that he seemed more relaxed during these late-night rounds, when most of the station's residents were asleep and there were fewer eyes watching him. "Excuse me," she said, stepping out of a side corridor. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Kethvar turned toward her, his red eyes glowing in the dim light. "Problem?" he asked. "Not exactly a problem," Sarah said. "More like an opportunity. I've been studying the Vorthak artifacts in the archives, and I was hoping you might be able to help me understand them better." The warrior stood completely still for several long moments. Sarah couldn't see his expression behind the helmet, but she got the impression that her request had caught him off guard. "You study the old things," he said finally. "Yes. I'm an archaeologist. I study ancient civilizations to understand how they lived, what they believed in, how they saw the world. The Vorthak artifacts are fascinating, but I can only learn so much from objects alone. If you're willing, I'd love to hear about your people from someone who actually knew them." Kethvar had not spoken about his people in centuries. The pain of loss and the weight of guilt had made those memories too heavy to share. But something about the human's genuine curiosity touched a part of him that had been buried for a very long time. "Why?" he asked. Sarah smiled. "Because every civilization deserves to be remembered for more than just how it died. Your people built things, created art, had families, told stories. Those things matter just as much as their military history, maybe more. I'd like to help preserve that knowledge before it's lost forever." For the first time since the destruction of his homeworld, HFY felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps his people's true legacy didn't have to die with him after all. The emergency alarm shattered the quiet of Nexus Prime at 0347 station time. Sarah woke instantly in her small quarters, her heart racing as the red warning lights flashed and an automated voice announced the crisis. "All security personnel report immediately. Civilian transport under attack in Sector 7. Multiple casualties confirmed." "This is not a drill." Sarah threw on her clothes and rushed toward the command center, joining streams of station personnel who were responding to the emergency. The corridors buzzed with urgent activity as medical teams prepared for incoming wounded and security forces organized their response. In the command center, Sarah found chaos. Multiple screens showed the attack in progress. A large civilian transport ship surrounded by smaller raider vessels. The raiders were fast and well armed, designed for hit-and-run attacks on defenseless targets. The transport carried over 300 passengers, mostly families traveling between colonies. "Where's our nearest patrol ship?" demanded Commander Crix, the Zilani administrator. 20 minutes out at best," replied a junior officer. "The transport won't last that long. The raiders are targeting the engines and life support systems." Sarah watched the tactical display with growing horror. The transport was slowly being torn apart while its desperate crew tried to organize an evacuation. Small escape pods were launching, but many were being shot down by the raiders before they could reach safety. "We need someone to buy them time," Crick said. "Someone who can get there fast and hold off the raiders until our forces arrive." "I'll go." The voice came from the back of the command center. Everyone turned to see HFY standing in the doorway, his massive form filling the entrance. His red eyes were fixed on the tactical display, studying the enemy positions with the practiced gaze of a warrior. "HFY, it's a suicide mission," Crick said. "There are 8 raider ships out there. Even you can reach them in 12 minutes, the warrior interrupted. "Fast interceptor. Hit-and-run tactics. Draw them away from the transport." Sarah stepped forward before she could stop herself. "I'm going with you." The entire command center fell silent. HFY's red eyes turned toward her and she could feel the weight of his stare. "No," he said simply. "You'll need a medic for the survivors," Sarah insisted, "and someone who can help coordinate the evacuation. I have emergency medical training, and I've worked in dangerous archaeological sites. I know how to handle myself in crisis situations." "You are not a warrior," HFY said. "Neither are the people on that transport," Sarah replied. "They need help, and we're the only ones who can reach them in time. We can argue about this or we can go save lives." HFY studied her for a long moment. The human showed no fear, only determination to help strangers in danger. It reminded him of something he had almost forgotten, the feeling of fighting for something greater than himself. "Stay behind me. Do exactly what I say. If I tell you to run, you run." "Understood." Minutes later, they were racing through space in a sleek interceptor ship. Sarah had never traveled so fast before. The stars blurred into streaks of light as HFY pushed the ship to its limits. His forearms moved across the controls with impossible speed and precision, making adjustments faster than her eyes could follow. "Tell me about the raiders," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Korthak pirates," HFY replied without taking his eyes off the controls. "Fast ships, light weapons. They rely on speed and surprise. Usually run when faced with real resistance. Usually. These ones are different. Organized, professional, someone hired them for this job." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Why would someone hire pirates to attack a civilian transport? Unknown. We'll find out after we stop them. The transport ship appeared on their screens, badly damaged and listing to one side. Several raider vessels circled it like predators, firing precise shots at critical systems. Sarah could see escape pods floating in space, some damaged, others trying desperately to reach safety. "What's the plan?" she asked. "Draw their attention. Make them angry. Give the transport time to evacuate. That's it?" "That's the whole plan?" For the first time since she had known him, Sarah heard something that might have been amusement in Kethvar's voice. Simple plans work best in combat. The interceptor screamed into the battle zone like a missile. Kethvar opened fire immediately, his shots striking the nearest raider ship with devastating accuracy. The pirate vessel exploded in a ball of flame, sending debris spinning through space. The other raiders reacted instantly, breaking off their attack on the transport to focus on this new threat. Sarah gripped her seat as their ship twisted and turned through a storm of enemy fire, Kethvar's piloting skills keeping them alive through impossible maneuvers. "Hold on," he said, launching their ship directly at a formation of 3 raiders. What followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever imagined. Kethvar fought the way his people had always fought, with precision, courage, and absolute commitment. He used every advantage the interceptor had, turning its speed and maneuverability against the larger raider ships. But Sarah quickly realized that this wasn't the mindless berserker rage that the legends described. Every move Kethvar made was calculated. He targeted engine systems to disable rather than destroy when possible. When a damaged raider ship tried to surrender, he let it retreat rather than finishing it off. He positioned their ship to protect escape pods from enemy fire, even when it put them at greater risk. "Transport is clear," Sarah reported, watching the tactical display. "All escape pods are away from the danger zone." "Good. Time to finish this." The remaining raiders had regrouped and were closing in for a coordinated attack. Sarah watched the enemy ships surround them and felt her heart sink. There were too many of them, and their interceptor was taking damage. That's when she saw something that changed everything she thought she knew about Kethvar. Instead of fighting to the death as she expected, the ancient warrior opened a communication channel to the raiders. His voice boomed across the radio frequencies, speaking in a language Sarah didn't recognize. The words seemed to carry weight and authority that transcended translation. The effect was immediate. The raider ships stopped firing and began to retreat, accelerating away from the battle zone as fast as their engines could carry them. "What did you say to them?" Sarah asked in amazement. "Told them who I was," Kethvar replied simply. "Some reputations carry more weight than weapons." By the time the station's security forces arrived, the battle was over. Sarah and Kethvar had transferred the rescued civilians to their interceptor and were guiding them back to Nexus Prime. The medical bay was prepared for casualties, but thanks to their intervention, most of the injured had only minor wounds. As they docked at the station, Sarah looked at her companion with new understanding. The fearsome warrior everyone was afraid of had just risked his life to save complete strangers. He had shown mercy to defeated enemies and used his reputation as a weapon to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. "Why doesn't anyone know?" she asked as they walked through the docking bay. "Why don't they understand what kind of person you really are?" Kethvar stopped walking and turned to face her. For a moment, his imposing presence seemed to soften, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the pain he carried. "Easier to be feared than understood," he said quietly. "Fear keeps distance. Distance keeps others safe from what I was." "But that's not what you are now," Sarah said. "What you did out there, that wasn't the action of a monster. That was a protector, someone who puts other people's lives before his own." Kethvar stood silent for a long moment, his red eyes studying her face. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You were not afraid." "No," Sarah admitted. "I wasn't. Should I have been?" "Everyone else is," Sarah smiled. "Well, I'm not everyone else, and maybe it's time people learned the truth about you." As they walked deeper into the station, Sarah noticed something different. Word of their rescue mission was already spreading, and the station's residents were looking at Kethvar with something new in their eyes. Not just fear, but respect. Some even nodded their thanks as he passed. For the first time in centuries, the ancient warrior didn't walk alone. 3 weeks after the rescue mission, Sarah found Kethvar in the archives late at night. He was standing perfectly still in front of a display case containing Vorthak's ceremonial weapons, his red eyes fixed on a curved blade that seemed to hold special meaning for him. "That one's different," Sarah observed, approaching quietly. "The markings are more elaborate than the others." "Honor blade," Kethvar said without looking away. "Given to warriors who showed exceptional courage in battle. I carried one like it for 300 years. What happened to it? Left it on my homeworld, with the others." Sarah heard the pain in his voice and decided not to push for details. Instead, she moved to stand beside him, studying the ancient weapon with professional interest. The craftsmanship is incredible, she said. Look at these engravings, they're not just decorative. They tell a story, don't they? Kethvar finally turned to look at her. How did you know? It's what I do. I read the stories that ancient civilizations left behind in their art and artifacts. This blade tells the tale of a great hunt, where warriors tracked a massive beast across 3 worlds to protect their people. The Void Stalker, Kethvar said quietly. It was destroying colony ships, killing thousands. Took us 2 years to find it and 3 days to bring it down. Lost 47 warriors in the final battle. Sarah made notes in her electronic tablet, recording his words carefully. Over the past few weeks, these conversations had become routine. Kethvar would share memories of his people, and Sarah would document them for her cultural preservation project. Were you there? In the hunt? I led it. His voice carried no pride, only sadness. Was my first command as a battle leader. Thought it made me a hero at the time. It did make you a hero, Sarah said firmly. You saved countless innocent lives. Did I? Or did I just create another legend of Vorthak violence? Another story for parents to frighten their children with? Sarah set down her tablet and faced him directly. Kethvar, what's really bothering you? Ever since the rescue mission, you've been different. Quieter, more withdrawn. People are starting to see you differently, but that seems to make you uncomfortable. The ancient warrior was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one was difficult to say. You asked me once why I let people fear me. Truth is more complicated than I told you. He moved away from the display case, his heavy footsteps echoing in the empty archives. Sarah followed, sensing that he was finally ready to share something he had kept buried for centuries. My people were not always warriors, he began. Once we were builders, explorers, artists. We created beautiful cities and wrote songs that could make the stars weep. But the galaxy was dangerous, and we learned to fight to protect ourselves. That sounds noble, Sarah said. It started that way. But somewhere along the path we forgot why we were fighting. Protecting became conquering. Honor became pride. Strength became cruelty. His voice grew harder. By the end, we were everything the legends say we were. Monsters who destroyed for the joy of destruction. They had reached his favorite spot in the archives, a quiet corner where few people ventured. Kethvar sat heavily on a bench designed for much smaller beings, and Sarah settled beside him. I was their champion, he continued. The greatest warrior of the greatest warrior race in the galaxy. Planets surrendered when they heard my name. Fleets fled rather than face me in battle. I thought I was glorious. What changed your mind? The last campaign. We were attacking a peaceful system. 3 worlds full of artists and teachers and farmers. They had no weapons, no defenses. Just families trying to live their lives. Kethvar's hands clenched into fists. I led the assault personally. Watched cities burn. Saw children running from my warriors. And I felt nothing, no regret, no mercy. Just satisfaction at another victory. Sarah felt a chill as she realized where this story was leading. When I returned to our homeworld to report the conquest, I found it in ruins. Our enemies had united while we were busy destroying innocents. They hit us with everything they had. Fusion bombs, plasma cannons, gravity weapons. Millions of my people died while I was off playing conqueror. Kethvar, do you understand now? He turned to face her, his red eyes burning with ancient pain. I am not a protector who was forced to become a warrior. I am a destroyer who learned too late the cost of destruction. Every life I save now cannot balance the scales of what I have done. Sarah sat in silence, absorbing the weight of his confession. She had suspected that Kethvar carried guilt about his past, but she hadn't imagined the full scope of his burden. How many worlds? She asked quietly. 17 systems. Billions of lives. His voice was barely audible. The Kepler colonies. The Twin Gardens. The crystal cities of Valdris. All gone because I was too proud to question orders, too savage to feel compassion. And you've been carrying this guilt alone for how long? 437 years, 8 months, 12 days. The precision of his answer broke Sarah's heart. He had been counting every moment of his isolation, treating it as penance for crimes he could never undo. That's why you withdrew from everyone, she said, understanding finally clicking into place. You believe you don't deserve forgiveness or friendship. I don't. That's not your choice to make, Sarah said firmly. Forgiveness isn't something you earn by suffering alone. It's something you earn by becoming better than you were. I can never be better than what I destroyed. No, but you can be better than what you used to be, and you already are. Sarah turned to face him fully. The Kethavar who led those attacks wouldn't have risked his life to save strangers. He wouldn't have shown mercy to defeated enemies. He wouldn't spend his time sharing the good memories of his people with someone who wants to preserve their real legacy. Kethavar shook his head. You don't understand. The things I did were terrible, Sarah interrupted. I'm not trying to excuse them or pretend they didn't happen. But I've spent weeks getting to know you, and the person I know isn't capable of those crimes anymore. You've changed, Kethavar. The question is whether you're brave enough to accept that change and move forward. The families of the dead would want you to be better. Would want their sacrifice to mean something. Every life you save, every act of protection you perform, every moment you choose mercy over violence. That's how you honor their memory. Not by wallowing in guilt, but by making sure nothing like that ever happens again. Kethavar was quiet for a long time, his massive form hunched with the weight of centuries. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, more uncertain. I don't know how to forgive myself. Start by accepting that you're worth forgiving, Sarah said gently. The Vorthak who destroyed those worlds is dead. He died when his people did. When he realized the cost of his actions, you're someone new now. Someone who protects instead of destroying. And the person you've become deserves a chance at redemption. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's the hardest thing in the universe. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. Sarah reached out and placed her small hand on one of his massive armored arms. The gesture was impossibly small, a tiny human offering comfort to an ancient giant. But somehow it felt like the most important moment of both their lives. I've been alone so long, Kethavar whispered. Sometimes I forget what it feels like to have someone care. Well, now you have someone who cares, Sarah said. And maybe if you're willing to try, you can have more than just someone. You can have friends, people who know your story and choose to stand by you anyway. For the first time in over 4 centuries, Kethavar allowed himself to hope that redemption might be possible. Not through suffering or isolation, but through connection, understanding, and the slow, difficult work of becoming worthy of the second chance he had been given. 6 months later, Nexus Prime was a very different place. The change started small, with individual acts of courage that rippled outward like waves. A young Zalani engineer named Jorik was the first to approach Kethavar directly, asking for self-defense training after hearing about the rescue mission. The ancient warrior's first instinct was to refuse, but Sarah's words about redemption echoed in his mind. Why do you want to learn? Kethavar asked. My sister works on a transport ship, Jorik replied nervously. If something like that pirate attack happens again, I want to be able to protect her. Kethavar saw something in the young alien's eyes that reminded him of his own people in their better days, the desire to protect those they loved. He agreed to teach Jorik basic combat techniques, starting with simple defensive moves and building slowly toward more advanced skills. Word spread quickly through the station's younger residents. Soon, Kethavar found himself running informal training sessions in one of the cargo bays, teaching beings from a dozen different species how to defend themselves and others. He was careful to emphasize restraint and protection over aggression, sharing lessons he had learned too late in his own life. Fighting is not about defeating enemies, he told his students. It is about protecting what matters. Never forget that distinction. The classes became popular, not just because of the practical skills they taught, but because they offered something that had been missing from the station community, a sense of shared purpose and mutual protection. Beings who had never spoken to each other before found themselves training together, learning to trust and depend on one another. Sarah watched these developments with growing pride and amazement. She had continued her cultural preservation project, documenting not just Vorthak history, but the stories and traditions of many species represented on the station. Her work with Kethavar had shown her the importance of preserving living culture, not just archaeological artifacts. The breakthrough came when a group of morphic artists approached Kethavar with an unusual request. They had heard about Vorthak's ceremonial designs from Sarah's research and wanted to incorporate them into a memorial sculpture for the station's central plaza. We want to honor all the species who have contributed to galactic peace, their spokeswoman explained, including yours. The Vorthak were warriors, yes, but they were also part of the galaxy's story. Kethavar was deeply moved by the gesture. For the first time in centuries, someone wanted to remember his people for something other than their violence. He worked closely with the artists, sharing traditional patterns and explaining their meanings, helping them create something beautiful that honored both the past and the present. The real test of the station's changing attitudes came during what became known as the arbitration crisis. Two powerful species, the hegemony of Kalar and the Terran Colonial Union, had a territorial dispute that threatened to explode into open warfare. Both sides had significant economic interests in Nexus Prime, and both demanded that the station choose sides in their conflict. Commander Crix was caught in an impossible situation. Supporting either side would alienate the other and potentially destroy the station's neutrality, but refusing to choose would likely result in both sides withdrawing their support, which would be economically devastating. The crisis came to a head when representatives from both governments arrived at the station simultaneously, each demanding immediate meetings and exclusive access to the administration. Tensions rose quickly as supporters of both sides gathered in the public areas, exchanging heated words that threatened to turn into violence. That's when Sarah made a suggestion that surprised everyone. "Let Kethvar mediate," she said during an emergency council meeting. "A Vorthak warrior?" Commander Crix looked shocked. "Sarah, they're terrified of him. How could he possibly help negotiate peace?" "That's exactly why he can help," Sarah insisted. "Both sides know his reputation. They know he's not afraid of either of them, and they know he has no political agenda. He's the only truly neutral party we have." But his people were destroyers. His people were also warriors who understood the true cost of war, Sarah interrupted. And Kethvar has spent centuries learning the value of peace. He knows better than anyone what happens when conflicts spiral out of control. Crix was skeptical, but the situation was desperate enough to try anything. He approached Kethvar with the proposal, expecting the ancient warrior to refuse. Instead, Kethvar considered it carefully. "I am not a diplomat," he said finally. "No," Crix agreed, "but you're someone both sides will listen to. And maybe that's what we need right now." The mediation sessions took place in the station's main conference room. Representatives from both governments sat across from each other, their bodyguards tense and ready for trouble. Between them sat Kethvar, his massive form serving as a physical reminder that violence would not be tolerated. At first, both sides tried to intimidate him with threats and displays of power. The Kalar representative spoke of their fleet strength and willingness to use force. The Terran delegate reminded everyone of humanity's reputation for resourcefulness in warfare. Kethvar listened to both sides without speaking, his red eyes moving between them as they made their arguments. When they finished, he leaned forward slightly and his voice filled the room. "I have fought in more wars than both your species combined," he said quietly. "I have seen planets burn and civilizations fall. I have watched good people die for bad reasons and bad people prosper from the suffering of others. Do you know what I learned from all of that?" The room was completely silent. War is the failure of imagination. It is what happens when beings cannot envision a solution that allows both sides to prosper. You sit here threatening each other's destruction, but neither of you has asked the important question. "Which is?" the Kalar representative asked nervously. "What do you actually want? Not what you demand. Not what you think you deserve, but what you truly need to secure the future of your people." What followed was unlike any negotiation in the station's history. Kethvar forced both sides to move beyond their initial positions and examine their underlying interests. He shared stories from his own experience about the hidden costs of conflict and the unexpected benefits of cooperation. When the Kalar spoke about their need for rare minerals, Kethvar asked if they had considered trade partnerships instead of territorial conquest. When the Terrans mentioned their security concerns, he questioned whether military expansion would actually make them safer or just create new enemies. Slowly, painfully, a different kind of solution began to emerge. Instead of fighting over the disputed territory, both sides agreed to joint development under neutral oversight. They would share the resources and the profits, while the territory itself would remain under the protection of an independent peacekeeping force. The agreement wasn't perfect, but it prevented a war that could have cost millions of lives. More importantly, it established a new model for resolving interspecies conflicts through mediation rather than force. As news of the successful arbitration spread throughout the station and beyond, Kethvar found himself in an unprecedented position. For the first time in his long life, beings sought him out not because they feared him, but because they respected his wisdom. A group of young Zilani asked him to tell them stories about the old days, not the battles and conquests, but the everyday life of his people. A Morphic philosopher wanted to discuss Vorthak concepts of honor and duty. Even the crystalline resonance, who communicated through harmonic frequencies, found that Kethvar could understand their song speech better than most translators. Sarah watched these developments with deep satisfaction. Her archaeological project had grown into something much larger, a living archive of galactic culture that brought different species together instead of keeping them apart. The culmination came during the station's annual Unity Festival, when representatives from dozens of species gathered to celebrate their diversity and cooperation. This year, the festival organizers asked Kethvar to give the opening address. Standing before thousands of beings from across the galaxy, the ancient warrior felt the weight of his long journey from destroyer to protector. He thought about his fallen people, the worlds he had once conquered, and the unlikely friendship that had shown him a different path. "We are all shaped by our past," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the vast assembly hall. "Our species, our cultures, our individual choices, they all leave marks on who we become. But the past does not have to define our future." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some familiar now, others still strangers, but all part of the community he had learned to protect and serve. "I was once a destroyer. My people were known throughout the galaxy as conquerors and warriors. But we were also artists, storytellers, protectors of the innocent. We were complex beings, just as all of you are complex. We made terrible mistakes, but we also did beautiful things." Sarah smiled from her place in the audience, remembering the nights they had spent in the archives, sharing stories and preserving memories. Today, we have the chance to learn from both the beauty and the mistakes of the past. We can choose to see each other as enemies to be feared, or as allies to be cherished.